Proposition 62, Drew Soderberg.
Yes, so I'll provide a little bit of background on the death penalty before getting into what Proposition 62 would do. I should note that this background would also apply to Proposition 66, which is also related to the death penalty. So following their often lengthy murder trials in Superior Court, condemned inmates are entitled to challenge their death sentence in both state and federal court in two ways, through direct appeals and habeas corpus petitions. These challenges can take a couple of decades to complete in California due to various factors such as delays in appointing these inmates' attorneys. As of April 2016, of the 930 individuals who have been sentenced to death since 1978, 15 have been executed, 103 have died prior to being executed, 64 have had their sentences reduced by their courts, such as through the legal challenge process I mentioned, and 748 are in state prison on death row with death sentences. Condemned male inmates are generally required to be housed in San Quentin, while condemned female inmates are housed in the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. The state currently has various procedures for handling death row inmates that increases the cost of housing these offenders. The vast majority of condemned inmates on death row are at various stages of the legal challenge process, and additionally, because of various issues surrounding the state's lethal injection procedures, no executions have taken place since 2006, though the state is currently in the process of drafting new regulations that would allow executions to resume. Under Prop 62, no offender could be sentenced to death by the state for first-degree murder, and individuals who are currently on death row would be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. In addition, those who, so that kind of sums up what Proposition 62 would do. In terms of fiscal effects, we estimated that it could result in net state and local savings of up to $150 million annually within a few years. These costs would be related to savings from reduced costs for murder trials and the legal challenges I mentioned, as well as reduced costs from housing inmates on death row.
In support, we have the Democratic Party and the Libertarian Party and the Peace and Freedom Party. And in opposition, we have the Republican Party. In support, civic organizations, legal and criminal organizations, religious and humanist organizations, SEIU, California Labor Federation, and the California Federation of Teachers. In opposition is taxpayer organizations, crime organizations, and firefighters, district attorneys. In support, we have Gavin Newsom, Bernie Sanders again, Betty Yee, Dave Jones, a whole bunch of elected officials, President Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter. So it's elected officials both within and outside California, including several former speakers of the assembly, mostly Democrats. And then in opposition, we have a number of elected officials too, former Governor Wilson and former Governor Deukmejian, district attorneys, sheriffs, and other elected officials, mostly Republicans. Support, almost every newspaper, well, every newspaper that has expressed an opinion is in support. And then the spending is relatively close on this one. We have a bit over $5 million in favor and $4 million against. The in favor, we have Reed Hastings again from Netflix. It's a bunch of other individuals. SEIU is also donating in favor. And then against, we have peace officers, correctional officers, highway patrol. So it's mostly police organizations that are against it. And then we have the related measure Proposition 66. So we're skipping ahead numerically because these two are linked.
So Proposition 66 seeks to shorten the time that legal challenges to death sentences take. It would seek to do this in several different ways. First of all, it would require that trial courts hear habeas corpus petitions first. So currently these petitions are heard immediately in the California Supreme Court. Under Proposition 66, they'd first be heard in trial courts and then could be appealed through the courts of appeal and eventually to the Supreme Court. It would place time limits on the challenges that legal challenges to death sentences take. For example, it would require the completion of the direct appeal and habeas corpus process within 5 years, and it would require the filing of the habeas corpus petition within 1 year of the attorney being appointed. It would also change the process for appointing attorneys. For example, it would require the Judicial Council and the California Supreme Court to consider changing the qualifications for attorneys that represent condemned inmates to increase the pool of attorneys available while at the same time attempting to ensure that they remain qualified. It would also make a couple of other key changes. The measure would allow the state to house condemned inmates at any prison rather than, so to remove the restrictions that require the state to hold most condemned inmates at San Quentin. It would also exempt the state's execution procedures from requirements to provide the public with an opportunity to participate in the development of those procedures. So in terms of fiscal effects, we really found that there'd be 3 primary fiscal effects. The first portion has to do with how Proposition 66 would affect the cost of an individual legal challenge. And we weren't able to really come to a conclusion there because there are some provisions in 66 that could increase the cost of an individual legal challenge, such as the provision that would require habeas corpus petitions to begin in trial courts that could lengthen the amount of time these petitions take and the cost associated with them. But there are other provisions that could decrease those costs, such as the time limits that the measure would put in place. Regardless of the effect on an individual case's cost, however, we find that given the state's backlog of hundreds of pending cases, there is likely to be near-term increases in state court costs, potentially in the tens of millions of dollars annually for years, from the acceleration of spending on cases for legal challenges. This acceleration in spending would then result in offsetting savings of a similar amount in future years. The measure could also reduce the cost of housing condemned inmates by giving the state's prison system flexibility to house them anywhere, and that could create tens of millions of dollars in savings, as well as additional savings should there be additional executions.
Great. So in support, we have the Republican Party. So this is sort of the flip side of the last measure, right? It's one or the other. We have the Republican Party. In opposition, we have the Democratic Party, Libertarian, Peace and Freedom, and some other Democratic organizations. In support, we have police organizations, DAs, crime survivors, the Class Foundation, other district attorneys. In opposition, civic organizations, religious organizations, California Federation of Teachers, SEIU, labor unions. In support, we have mostly elected officials who are Republicans, but also sheriffs and district attorneys. And then in opposition, we have Lieutenant Governor Newsom, Senator Boxer, and a number of other, mostly Democratic elected officials. The newspapers are in support. And then the expenditures, we have $4.5 million saying yes, and 5.5, a little over 5.5 on the no side. The yes side is mostly supported by public employees, peace officers, police, organizations. And then against, we have Reed Hastings again, and a number of other individuals, the ACLU, SEIU Union, and other individuals, including an actor from MASH, the TV show, obviously. And the important thing to know about these two, and we have another set that are paired, is that whichever gets the highest number of votes ends up going into law, so they can't both do that. Do you have anything else to say about that part? Okay. Questions? Right up here.
Yes. Proposition 66 states that other propositions, measures related to the death penalty are void. So wouldn't that automatic, if both 62 and 66 got affirmative votes, wouldn't 66 automatically void 62?
It would be up to the courts to interpret how to implement that measure, but presumably if 62 got more votes than 66, one possible outcome. I mean, it seems likely that the courts would rule that 62 would stand over 66, even though they both got enough to pass.
Another question?
If the prisons will no longer be involved in developing the specific method of execution, who would be?
So the prisons would continue to be involved. Basically right now, all regulations, the regulations for lethal injection are subject to a sort of public comment phase. And what Prop 66 would do is eliminate that requirement when it comes to lethal injection regulations. But the prison system would still be involved in making those.
Another question?
We were at a lecture by Barry Scheck of the Innocence Project, and he said these cases would take priority over all others and tie up the courts and keep all other cases from being heard in a timely manner. Is that true?
It would really depend on how the court chose to implement it. That would be sort of up to the California Supreme Court and the other courts that are implementing 66. That's sort of one of the uncertainties and why it was difficult for us to come to a conclusion about the fiscal effect on the cost of an individual legal challenge.
Thank you.